become part of Russia, though for the moment they're still in Georgia, and for the moment they are what I call pretending to be countries. South Ossetia and Abkhazia are claiming to be countries. Not many other countries agree with that. Okay? And part of this Russian presence has been even military in Abkhazia. Pretty strange thing to have military bases in a different country. Okay. Secondly, then, we have Ukraine. Well, specifically in 2014, Russia moved into Ukraine's territory of Crimea, and Russia annexed that. Now, at first, certainly that seems odd because this is another country and Ukraine is for Ukrainians. Well, one would think. And in fact, that was, of course, the premise of these republics of the Soviet Union, that you're a republic because that's your ethnic group, your ethnic homeland. And indeed, Ukrainians are a majority of Ukraine. But there is a notable Russian minority, and it's not just evenly scattered across Ukraine, not just randomly placed, but it is more concentrated in certain areas, including Crimea. So in 2014, Putin saw an opportunity. It's an interesting article here about it by author Daniel Treisman. He describes it as an improvised gambit. An opportunity arose and Putin improvised and went for it. What happened here was that Ukraine was poised and leaning towards Europe. They had worked on an agreement with the European Union, not to join, but to have more economic ties and more trade in the European Union to make it easier. Well, Putin was not happy about this. He did not like Ukraine looking that way. He wanted Ukraine looking more towards Russia, more ties with Russia. And he convinced the Ukrainian president to not go ahead with the plans with the European Union and to do more with Russia. Well, this got a lot of Ukrainians unhappy with this president, and soon it revealed his corruption, and he was run out of office, and a new president was put in. And, well, yeah, that's a moment of vulnerability. And Putin took that opportunity to take action and to go for Crimea. He could argue ethno-territorialism with this, because Crimea is mostly Russian. It was part of Ukraine, but this piece, this peninsula, it's just barely connected to the mainland there in the Black Sea. So it is a peninsula and not an island. Majority Russian. So again, under this Soviet system that Russia inherited, the idea is who lives there, that's what kind of government should be provided. That's who should have the government. So you could argue, Putin could argue that Crimea should be Russian. And in fact, it used to be. For the first portion of Soviet era, it was part of Russia. It was an ASSR for a while. It was simply an oblast for a while in Russia. But then after Stalin, the new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, changed it up, gave it to Ukraine. It was seen as a kind of friendly gift from Russia to Ukraine. It obviously fit with Ukraine because it touches Ukraine. It doesn't touch Russia, but it still had this odd piece of majority Russian population. Well, eventually, of course, the Soviet Union broke up. Ukraine inherited all of the Ukrainian republics, so Crimea was part of the new country, Ukraine. However, there was another complication here because the Black Sea had been one of Russia's sources for its navy, places for its navy. They also had naval vessels in the Arctic Ocean, in the Baltic Sea, and in the Pacific Ocean's Sea of Okhotsk, but they also had some of their fleet here in the Baltic, in the Black Sea. And here in the Black Sea, then, now, well, the naval base was on Crimea. That was fine during the Soviet Union, it was all one country. But now what happens to the naval base when Crimea becomes part of Ukraine? So at that point, Russia negotiated an arrangement with Ukraine that Russia could maintain a naval base on Crimea. Now Putin says the government's vulnerable. Putin says the throwing out of the president was not fair, was not constitutional, was illegitimate. He needs to protect Russians in Crimea. Russians are majority Crimea. He needs to protect the Russian naval base in Crimea. All right, he needs to take over. He needs to take the whole thing. So he does. He gets the benefit of adding the population of Crimea to the Russian total, which doesn't hurt because we've seen that Russia's total population is likely to decline. So, okay, add some more people. Good. And who's going to stop him? In fact, nobody did. Yes, Western countries disagreed. Yes, there were some protests. But in fact, no one did too much about it. Maybe it was the impromptu kind of circumstances that Putin just improvised and did it, didn't allow Western countries to prepare a response quickly. Maybe it was that it made some sense that, well, it was a majority Russian and had a Russian naval base. In any case, not much was done to oppose Russia. Russia took Crimea. All right, but then shortly after that, fighting in eastern Ukraine happened. And at first it seemed like it was just these kind of rebels out there on the Russian side, clearly fighting in East Ukraine to try to physically occupy these lands. It didn't take too long to find out that really these were people supported by the Russian government, and then progressively became more and more of the Russian military. And this kind of low-level fighting went on for several years, with the idea that Eastern Ukraine has a lot of Russian speakers. On this map, you can see that pattern where the darker shaded areas have more and more people who are native Russian speakers. And you can see, not random, Western Ukraine has relatively few people who are native Russian speakers. Almost everybody is a native Ukrainian speaker. And you notice in the bottom southeast side, there is the peninsula, Crimea, and you can see it's the darkest shade on this map with a majority of natives there speaking Russian. All right, so these rebels were saying, you know, this should be part of Russia too. East Ukraine should be part of Russia also. And it simmered there for a number of years until this year. And as you know, now Russia has moved their military forces officially into Ukraine. And we now have war in Ukraine. Though Putin called it a special military operation. Well, that's what we call a euphemism, a nicer sounding word or phrase that really doesn't usually explain what the thing actually is. It's war. That's what it is. All right, so Putin has invaded using this idea of ethno-territorialism, that these areas are majority Russian and should be part of Russia. And he's also added a bunch of wild-eyed lies about why Russia has moved in. He claimed that Russia needed to move in to denazify Ukraine, to get rid of the Nazis in Ukraine. Well, I know that Russia still remembers World War II very well, and Nazi Germany did invade the Soviet Union. Yes. And Russia's very proud that they were on the winning side of that war. But that was a long time ago. There are not large numbers of Nazis in Ukraine. There are not Nazis running the government in Ukraine. The president is not a Nazi. In fact, the president is Jewish, and some of his ancestors were killed by the Nazis. It's unbelievable that he could be considered a Nazi. So, no. A lot of what Putin says about this, a lot of what the Russian government propaganda says about this is just false. It's just lies. The idea of, well, it's Russians living here. Well, that one, that's reality. There are Russians living there. And this idea of ethno-territorialism, okay, you could logically argue that Russia should have this piece of territory because it's a majority of Russians living there. However, that's not how it turned out. This country has been there for 3 decades. You can't just now go in and kill lots of people to say, well, this piece should be ours. No, that's obviously immoral and wrong. And the way they're doing this, killing lots of civilians, sometimes probably counts as war crimes. However, they're there, and it's not going to go away too easily. The Donetsk region is the core of this Russian majority population, but we see them expanding from the fight to other areas. They did try to capture the capital, Kyiv, but failed to do so. But the war is still going on and still could expand past those regions. All right. Well, that's a little bit of what Russia has done. Now, what do I think Russia will do? Okay, one thing is I think they're not going to return Crimea. Not going to happen. They've got it. They've got it. They've got a naval base there. Even if the rest of Ukraine doesn't turn out very well for them, I'm saying they're still keeping Ukraine. I'm sorry, still keeping Crimea. But now the key question is, what about the rest of Ukraine? What could happen in this war? Well, possibly Russia could win and just take all of Ukraine and just make it part of Russia. Right now, that seems unlikely because Russia has done very poorly in the war. Their military has not lived up to its reputation. They've had many failures in military equipment, in personnel, in logistics, and just been outperformed by the Ukrainians. So it seems unlikely that this is going to happen. Not likely they'll get all of Ukraine. Another possibility would be they get all of Ukraine, but instead of making it part of Russia, it stays as a country, Ukraine, but Russia puts its own people in as the top government officials, so that Russia is basically in control of the government while there's still a country, Ukraine. That too seemed more possible before Russia did so poorly and less likely now. A third possibility, which does seem more likely, is that Russia will annex these pieces that have majority Russian population, especially these Donetsk and Lugansk regions. And I think this might be a solution that provides the saving face for Putin. Putin, as a dictator, always wants to be seen as making the right choice, as doing the best thing, as winning. Dictators don't like to lose. How can Putin get out of this war while saving face, while saying, oh, we got what we wanted. We accomplished our means. Mission accomplished. You know, since he falsely made the claim about Nazis, he could falsely claim that he got rid of all the Nazis. That would be something. But he could also say, okay, well, we got these territories. This is what we really wanted. We needed to bring these Russians back to Russian territory. Maybe. Well, just the other day, the Washington Post published an article saying that American intelligence sources believe that Russia is going to announce this, going to announce that they are annexing these regions. Just in the middle of the war, they're just going to say, oh, we're doing it. Boom. Okay. So it does seem plausible that this may be a result of the war, or maybe the final result of the war. A way for Putin to say that he won and for the fighting to stop. At the same time, Ukraine might not agree to that. You know, they still are in the right to say, this is our country. We don't have to give up any of the pieces. So what do they do? What do they do if Russia says, all right, we're taking Donetsk and Lugansk regions. We're moving all of our troops back to those regions. You can still have the rest of Ukraine, but we're keeping this. Does Ukraine fight on? Yeah, that's a tricky question. Maybe they do. Maybe they say, we're not giving up anything, and they continue the battle. Maybe they say, well, this is regrettable, but okay, to maintain the safety of the rest of our country, we'll let you have those pieces. Or there could still be something else, some other version of this that doesn't seem apparent yet, but things do change. So possibly something else. Well, keeping Ukraine fits these models, fits the idea of ethno-territorialism. If they keep just that piece of Ukraine, it would help the Russian population again by adding some people to the country. And yes, it'd be another piece of those Soviet days that they would get back if that happens. Would Russia then stop? Or would it look for other opportunities? So for instance, number 3, would Russia like part of Estonia? Estonia, one of our 3 Baltic states, the one closest to Finland there. Estonia does have Russian population. During the Soviet period, lots of Russians were moved into Estonia. And so you can see from this map, similar to the other map of language patterns, the darker shaded areas have more and more Russian speakers. Most of Estonia, not so many, but some near the capital city Tallinn. And then in the northeast corner is the city Narva, which is quite highly Russian and borders on Russia there. Now, it's not a hugely populated city, but it is the 3rd largest in Estonia. Would Russia like to have that piece of Estonia to be part of Russia? I'm going to say yes, they would like to have that piece. I'm going to say they're not getting it. And one big difference between Estonia and Ukraine is that Estonia is in NATO. Ukraine is not in NATO. NATO and the United States are supporting Ukraine by providing them with military equipment, but NATO is not fighting the war with people. We are not sending American soldiers to Ukraine. In contrast, NATO does include Estonia. And Rule 5 of the NATO Charter says that if any NATO country is attacked, all NATO countries are obliged to defend them. So if Russia did attack Estonia, the United States and all of NATO would be obliged to defend them and thus be directly in war with Russia. I don't think Russia is up for that, certainly after this relatively poor performance in Ukraine. That would be a very bad choice for them to make for a piece of territory. And ironically, the Russians in Narva, when asked, generally say, no, we're just fine here in Estonia. They probably have a higher quality of life in Estonia than they would have in Russia. So, interested? Probably. Getting it? Probably not. What about Latvia? Would Russia be interested in a piece of Latvia? Well, again, here's a similar sort of map about language. You can see that in the capital city of Riga, there are quite a few Russian speakers, but in particular, that southeastern corner has a higher population of Russian speakers in Latvia. And that includes a second largest city in Latvia, Daugavpils, 94,000. Okay, again, not a huge city, but the second largest in Latvia. Would Russia like to have this piece? I'm going to say probably not, and even lower likelihood of actually getting it. First of all, Latvia is also in NATO, so the same thing that was true for Estonia is true for Latvia. But in addition, this piece of Latvia borders Belarus and not Russia. This piece here borders Belarus. So Russia would be adding a piece that doesn't connect to it. So even though there are Russian speakers there, I don't think this one would be very practical. Number 5, would Russia like to have a piece of Kazakhstan? I'm going to say yes. I think Russia very much would like to have a piece of Kazakhstan. Here again is a linguistic map. Darker shaded areas have more Russian speakers. And notice that it's the northern areas where they have the border with Russia. And these territories in Kazakhstan have quite a few natural resources. So there is some mineral wealth for sure here in these regions. Would Russia like to have it? I'm going to say yes, for sure they would now like to have it. Are they going to get it? I put an asterisk here because I think that it depends a lot on how they do in Ukraine. And so far, they have not done well in Ukraine. If this ends up and they feel successful in Ukraine, I think that increases the chances that they also go for peace of Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is not in NATO. And I think it would be very difficult for other countries to help Kazakhstan defend against Russia. It's going to be in the middle of that Eurasian landmass. It's going to be difficult for other countries to supply Kazakhstan with support. To the south of Kazakhstan, you have other Central Asian countries like Uzbekistan. It's going to be hard to get military equipment into Uzbekistan to get into Kazakhstan. To the east, it's China. Not likely getting much support there. To the west, there's the Caspian Sea and Russia. To the north, there's Russia. So I think if they feel that Ukraine has been a good success, they could pretty easily win in Kazakhstan also. So maybe. Number 6, let's go back to Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia. I think there's quite a good chance that Russia will get these pieces. Some of it, again, will depend on how they do in Ukraine, but Georgia is not a member of NATO. But now they are trying to get into NATO. They're hoping that NATO will fast track them and get them into NATO. Because, yeah, they would like that support of NATO if Russia tries to take Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Don't know how quickly Georgia can get in if they do get into NATO, and don't quite know what Abkhazia and South Ossetia want to do. Right now, as I say, they're pretending to be independent countries. Will they try to maintain that, or would they be happy to be part of Russia instead? Well, we'll see. But I think, yeah, this is also very tempting for Russia to add these pieces of land. Number 7, maybe taking Transnistria from Moldova. Here's a map of Transnistria. It's the red section there that technically belongs to Moldova. Transnistria is the territory that is along the Dniester River right there. And it is quite industrial and quite Russian in population. So it has economic value and, again, fits this model of who lives there. Mostly Russians. It should belong to this little country, Moldova. Well, if you look to the right, there's Ukraine, okay? And the city Odessa is there. And in the very southeast corner of the map, that is a corner of Crimea there. So if Russia progressed in eastern Ukraine, connected eastern Ukraine to Crimea, and then went a bit farther along the south coastline there of Ukraine, they could connect to Transnistria. And I think if they successfully did that in Ukraine, they would also claim Transnistria as part of Russia. So what happens to Transnistria, I think, depends largely on how far Russia gets in Ukraine. I don't think Russia would like to claim Transnistria as part of Russia if it doesn't connect to Russia, if it's not land connection there. It'd just be this awkward extra piece, an exclave would not be terribly useful like that. So maybe they'll take Transnistria, but only, I think, if they can get enough of Ukraine to connect to that. And number 8, ironically, could they lose land on the other side? Could they lose the Kuril Islands to Japan? Well, the Kuril Islands for many years have gone back and forth, different times, different islands. Sometimes that island's Russian, sometimes it's Japanese, sometimes more or less different combinations. But right at the end of World War II, I mean, right at the very end of World War II, Russia took all the remaining islands of the Kuril Island chain here, took every island that was Japanese and made it part of the Soviet Union. Now you see one island there named Sakhalin, that's a Russian island. Just south of that is a big island, that's Hokkaido, which is Japanese. But then you see that string of islands of the Kuril Islands that goes up to the Kamchatka Peninsula. Kamchatka is also Russian. And now Russia has all of those little islands there, the Kuril Islands. Russia inherited those from the Soviet Union. Russia likes having that so because it makes the Sea of Okhotsk very much their own personal sea. Okay? They control pretty much all sides of that. And if they want to have a Navy ship leave the Sea of Okhotsk to go out to the Pacific Ocean, well, it just passes by the Kuril Islands and it's fine. If Japan owned lots of those Kuril Islands, then that could be awkward for Russian ships to pass through Japanese waters by these islands. Well, they never actually signed a peace treaty over these islands. It's technically in dispute since World War II. And now Japan, what if Japan says, well, look at the Kuril Islands. The people there are actually much closer to Japanese than to Russian. So we're going to take them. Just like you're claiming in Ukraine that you should have it because it's more Russian, you should have part of Ukraine. Well, we're going to say we should have the Kuril Islands. That would be an ironic twist and somewhat logical. I think it's still unlikely, but a curious possibility. All right, it's been now 105 years since the revolution that ended the Russian Empire and began the Soviet Union. I've been arguing that, though, the effects of the Soviet Union still are felt in Russia and the surrounding countries now. Part of that is ethno-territorialism. The Soviet system giving some autonomy to ethnic groups on their homelands was then inherited by Russia. And Russia has been using this system within its borders, but also to think about areas extending its borders, as now in Eastern Ukraine. They can use that as justification, as explanation. But again, I still say it's unacceptable that they have attacked Ukraine. It's still a different country. Another effect of the Soviet life is indeed Vladimir Putin himself, as a former KGB agent who's now ironically acting even like an older Russian figure. He's acting quite a bit like the Tsar of the Russian Empire, essentially as a dictator. So we can ask, why is Putin doing this? And it is difficult to get into his head to try to figure this out. And it does feel also a bit like Soviet days. Back in the Soviet days, American scholars would try to figure out, well, what's going on in this somewhat secretive society? And there would be lots of analysis on trying to infer things, even like where the politicians were standing for festivals and parades. Were they standing next to the leader, or was that politician quite a ways away from the leader? Who had more influence? Trying to figure these things out. Well, yes, we're now trying to figure out Putin as well. I think some of it is definitely his interest in making Russia great again. He did say that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. It broke up a superpower and it lost so much in land and population. Yes, I feel confident this is part of his motivation. He wants to make Russia great again. A new idea, though, and a curious way of putting this, is that he wants to stop time. I read this idea from a Russian scholar the other day, and I find it intriguing. He wants to stop time. He looks at the new generation of Russians, and he sees and he doesn't like. He sees this new generation of Russians as so different. First of all, they were born after the Soviet Union ended. So the young generation, 30 and under, they don't know what it's like, what it was like to live in the Soviet Union. They don't have the same sense of the great victory in World War II. That's ancient history for them. And they look more towards Europe and become more European in what they buy and do and listen to. and Putin finds it offensive. They're not being true Russians. They're not following the true Russian path. And they're not going to bring Russia great again. And he finds this unacceptable. So he has to stop time. He has to stop time so that this generation can't come to power in the same way. They can't be the ruling generation in the same way that they want. They can't bring Russia more towards Europe. Well, how can he stop time to do that? Well, he can invade Ukraine. He can invade Ukraine and turn all of Europe against him and make Russia the bad guy. He's okay being the bad guy. Make Russia the bad guy, and thus make it impossible for the next generation to be pals with Europe. Instead, Russia will have to work its own path, and Russia will need to be great separately again. It's a very interesting idea. Certainly, the younger generation is different. The 20s and up to 30-year-old people are quite a bit more European in their interest. For instance, they're also much more receptive or open to the LGBTQ population, whereas older Russians are not at all so. Putin is not so. Yeah, new ideas. No, he doesn't want the new ideas, the new ways of the youth. He can stop time. He can stop time while he can still define his legacy. He can still be the guy who makes Russia great again. He can still be the guy who brings parts of Russia back, who brings the Russian side of Ukraine into Russia. He could still be that guy, and Russia will remember him forever for that. Especially if it's true that he's sick. We don't know this one either. This is very much like in Soviet days. There was lots of speculation about the health of leaders. There were two ancient leaders, well, really old men, Chernenko and Andropov, who came after after Brezhnev and before Gorbachev. They had these two really old communist leaders, and both of them had pretty poor health. And the reports, official reports were, oh, he's got a cold. No, it was much worse than a cold, and he soon died. Okay. Well, the same kind of speculation is being done now about Putin. Is he sick? In some recent video of him, it's seen that his hand is shaking, or sometimes he seems to be latching on to things. The side of a chair, he's just got a very tight grip on it so that he can control his hand and that it's not shaking. Or maybe, this is one of the speculative points, might he have Parkinson's disease? That shakiness is one of the key characteristics or symptoms of Parkinson's. It does seem like his face is puffier than usual. That can be a sign of steroid use, that he may be on heavy steroid treatments. Okay. Well, if he is sick, if in fact his doctors have given him only a few years to live, he needs to stop time. He needs to act now to preserve his legacy, now to put Russia on the right path to greatness before he's gone. Have you seen any of the photos of him meeting with other people recently? There was one, he was meeting a bigwig from the European Union recently. Did you see the table? The table is like 30 feet long. Yes, really, one table, 30 feet long. And he's at one end and the other guy's at the other end. I wonder if this is because he's sick and he's worried that if he gets COVID, that's it. So he has 30 feet of distance between him and this other guy who probably doesn't have COVID, but just in case, Putin is far, far away. There was a meeting just before, or was it just the war had just started, I think, and he had a gathering of a number of advisors in a big ballroom kind of setting, and he was at a small table at one end, and everybody else was on the other side, rimming the other wall of this large room. And he put people on the spot, asking them what they thought of the military operation. And you could see these other officials wanting to give their true opinion, but big-eyed, trying to say what they thought Putin wanted them to say. And it reminded me of Stalinist days also. Every now and then, for instance, Stalin would go visit a factory or something, bring an award to a factory. And so when he appeared at a factory, and people started clapping for him, all the workers would gather and applaud, of course. But no one wanted to stop. No one wanted to be the first person to stop clapping, because then someone could say, oh, look at Bob there, look at Ivan there. He apparently doesn't like Stalin. He stopped clapping. And Ivan might get sent away. So what would normally be a politician coming to a factory, people clap for 30 seconds. They might clap for 30 minutes. No one wanting to stop. Well, this Putin thing reminded me of that. Puts people on the spot, live on camera, asking their opinion, and they're trying to figure out what he wants them to say, not what they think the truth is. Well, maybe this distancing that he does is because he's already sick with something serious. And yeah, if he would catch COVID or even the flu, maybe that would be it. So why is Putin doing this? We don't really know all the reasons. We speculate. I'm pretty confident it's part of an idea to make Russia great again. And I'm intrigued by this idea that he wants to stop time. All right, that's one piece of this. Now I'm going to switch to this one to give you a related, but in part separate notion of this inheritance from the Soviet system and how we got to this point. Soviet ethnic policies. Well, clearly this does relate to Soviet ethno-territorialism, the ethnic-based regions, but it's a different set of things too. Soviet ethnic policies. In Central Asia, the Soviet ethnic policy was nation building. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that, but Central Asia is in the Eastern world now and not in our Western world. So a little bit about that. In the Caucasus, that's Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, gerrymandering was the policy. Now, you may have heard of gerrymandering. We do this in America with our political parties. It's stupid, it's dumb, it's unfair, but both parties do this when they get a chance. It's the drawing of political borders to favor one or another group. So who's ever in power in a state tries to draw the borders of voting districts to give their candidates the best chance of winning. And if you see an article on this in a newspaper, for instance, or online, there'll often be a map of a district, and the district will be zigzagging all over to create this very weird shape, voting district, but at great calculation to try to maximize their chance of winning in those districts. Well, in the Caucasus, there was an additional twist on this gerrymandering. And in the Baltic states, we have Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Dilution, especially in Estonia and Latvia, was the Soviet strategy. All right, let's look at these. In Central Asia, when the Soviet Union started out, people in Central Asia did not have the kind of ethnic identities that we think of now. People identified themselves largely as Muslims, so it's a Muslim region, but also by their lifestyle, their economic lifestyle, rather than as an ethnic group like we think of now. So there were people who were nomadic herdsmen. To be Kazakh meant you were a native nomadic herdsman. That's what you did. That was your way of life. Uzbek comes from the word bek, which means lord of the manor, essentially. It means you're a wealthy landowner, a bek, or sometimes bey. Uzbek, that means of that person, connected to, belonging to that person. So basically, an Uzbek was someone who worked on a large farm. Didn't own the farm, but worked on the large farm. Other people had their identities too as bandits, as traders, as nomads, but those that went up or down mountainsides instead of across plains. Ethnic identity was different. It was an economic identity largely. And then came Stalin. And Stalin drew these borders. You can see there, the borders of Uzbekistan. He drew those borders sometimes in odd ways. You see it zigzags quite a bit. And he said, hey, you see, this is Uzbekistan, and you people living here, look around, look around. You must be an Uzbek. What does it mean to be an Uzbek? Oh, well, you have this culture. Look around. Oh, who are these Uzbeks? Oh, well, look at the history of the Uzbeks. What history? Oh, well, Stalin had his historians write the history of the Uzbek people. Except there was no history of the Uzbek people because they weren't an ethnic group. They were Muslims who had a typical way of earning a living. So Stalin's historians faked it and wrote the history of the Uzbek people. It's not true. It's not a true history. But he needed a history to help these people have an ethnic identity to belong together. So he maximized this traditional sort of ethnic identity, what we think of as ethnic identity, and made them Uzbeks, and made them Kazakhs, and made them Turkmen, and so forth, and said, here are your borders. What was Stalin thinking? His goal was to avoid them working together. For instance, they're almost all Muslims. They could have united as Muslims to oppose the new atheist communist country. It was a new and somewhat fragile country. So that would be bad. That could be very bad if everybody in Central Asia got together to oppose the Soviet state. But what if now they're all separate? What if the Uzbeks think, oh, we're not like Kazakhs, we're not like Turkmen? It never occurs to them to work together because they're separate and different. That was Stalin's goal in Central Asia. All right, in the Caucasus, the idea was gerrymandering, but the group to be protected by gerrymandering was the Soviet state again. So early on in the Soviet Union, when they're drawing the borders for these pieces, these republics, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, Stalin drew the borders intentionally to cause trouble. And the principal example is the one highlighted here. You see a region called Nagorno-Karabakh. Well, when the Soviet Union was started up, that's where Stalin put it. And Armenians said, whoa, that's not right. Wait a minute. All the people who live there are Armenian. Obviously, it's supposed to be part of the Armenian Republic. Azerbaijan said, seems just fine. Armenia said, no, they're Armenians, so it's part of Armenia. That's how you're establishing these ethnic-based regions. Obviously, it's part of Armenia. Well, I think, yes, frankly, based on ethno-territorialism, it should be part of Armenia. But Soviet leadership, Stalin, no, they never changed it. So for 70 years or so, Armenia and Azerbaijan were in conflict over this. They were angry about this. Armenia kept claiming it. Azerbaijan kept saying, we're happy to have it. And they could never change it. Well, that was Stalin's idea. Armenia and Azerbaijan are never going to get together to oppose the Soviet state, to be troublesome, if they're focused on their own little squabble right there. So Stalin drew the borders to help protect the Soviet Union, the new Soviet Union, by causing local conflict there. In the Baltic states, especially in Estonia and Latvia, the policy was dilution. Dilute ethnic concentrations by moving in Russians. So a lot of Russians, were sent to live in Estonia and Latvia. So what may have been like 95% Estonian, now Russians move in. Now it's 90%. Now it's 85%. Now it's 80% Estonian. Okay, more Russians move in. The idea being, well, how can they focus their ethnic identity if we mix so many other Russians in? That will clearly weaken their ethnic identity. And undoubtedly, some Estonians will marry some Russians. Their kids will be half and half. That will just mix it all up too. So that was the idea, to again protect the Soviet state by weakening ethnic concentration in Estonia. That's the Estonian flag there, and it was illegal to own that flag during the Soviet days. So what happened? Fast forward then to Mikhail Gorbachev. When he's running the country, he's the young reformer, and he's going to try to fix communism. Remember, he's going to try to fix communism, but didn't have a good plan, and that's why Perestroika happened, as Steve Rosefield called it, after the Soviet Union ended. It was a mess. Okay, so Gorbachev trying to fix the Soviet Union. He puts in a new economic policy to reconstruct the economy. He calls that Perestroika. And he has a new policy called glasnost, which in Russian means openness. And the idea here is to have a more open society, a society where people can say what they want to, and it'll be okay. Maybe sort of like our American freedom of speech, at least not like Stalin, or if you said a joke that made Stalin look bad, you might be sent to prison. No, make it okay if people want to criticize the government. We're going to try to create a better place, says Gorbachev. Well, what happens then when people can say what they want? Well, a lot of Uzbeks said, we hate communism and we'd like to have our own country. Well, look at that. If Stalin, many decades earlier, hadn't intentionally boosted the idea of ethnic Uzbeks, would they decades later have an ethnic consciousness and say, we want our own country? Maybe not. Maybe not. It's definitely arguable that Stalin, what he did much later then, helped end the Soviet Union. Uzbek identity was, hey, yeah, we want our own country because we're Uzbeks. And this communist thing, we hate it. And it helped end the Soviet Union. Ironic, isn't it? Because Stalin put the policy in early in the Soviet Union to help protect the Soviet Union. But decades later, it probably helped end the Soviet Union. What about over here? Well, for several decades, Armenians were just really angry about this, and it made them very intense Armenians. It really heightened their ethnic consciousness. So when under glasnost they could say what they wanted to say, they too said, we hate communism and we want to have our own country. Yeah, okay. Isn't that ironic that what Stalin did early on to help protect the Soviet Union over the decades heightened ethnic concentration and helped end the Soviet Union? All right, then the Soviet Union ends. Now what happens here about Nagorno-Karabakh? Okay, well, for several decades, Armenia and Azerbaijan were angry with each other about this place. So what do you do now when you're new independent countries? Well, of course, you immediately go to war over that land. They did, but neither side could produce a victory. It just became a stalemate after quite a bit of fighting. They agreed to a ceasefire and an odd sort of choice. They decided they'd let Nagorno-Karabakh pretend to be a country. So for several years, that's what was happening. Nagorno-Karabakh was acting like it was its own country. Then, quite recently, Azerbaijan attacked Nagorno-Karabakh. They were innovative. They had better equipment. They actually used, in a number of cases, military drones that they acquired from Turkey and were very successful and displaced all the Armenians and took control of Nagorno-Karabakh. Some Armenians died. Many Armenians took everything and went back to the rest of Armenia. Many of those burned their own homes down in Nagorno-Karabakh so that the Azeri people would not get nice houses. So that's the current situation, is Azerbaijan has control over that. Yeah, Stalin drew the border intentionally, and there's still a mess because of that. Okay, in Estonia, it was illegal to own this flag during the Soviet Union. The day that Estonia became an independent country, everybody put their flag out on display. That's interesting, huh? Lots of Estonians owned this flag. It was illegal to own the flag, but lots of Estonians owned the flag. They kept it tucked away, kept it hidden. And then when they became independent, boom, out came the flag. You see, dilution failed in the same sort of way. It, in the end, intensified ethnic identity. It made a lot of Estonians angry that so many Russians moved into Estonia. It made them angry that many of these Russians didn't bother to learn Estonian language. They just lived there and used Russian language anyway. It made the Estonians angry. So when, under Gorbachev, people could say what they wanted, Estonians said, we hate communism and we want our own country. And they too got it. So this one also, the Soviet policy in the beginning was supposed to help protect the Soviet Union, but in the end, it helped end the Soviet Union. All right, and so what's going on now? Well, since Central Asia, they have had Soviet-type dictators. They inherited that too from the Soviet system. Once they became independent countries, they had new governments, but they didn't have very good governments, and quickly they ended up with dictatorships. The weirdest one is easily Turkmenistan. They have had two dictators. The first one well, they're both wacky, but the first one had a gold statue built of himself, and it would rotate so it always faced the sun. The first one, he changed the names of the months of the year, naming one of them for his mother, in fact. Yeah, and you don't want to do anything that might look bad. There's a video clip that was secretly taken out of the country of the second dictator in a horse race. Yes, the second dictator entered himself in a horse race. Okay, and so can you imagine being one of the other riders in this horse race? Are you going to try to beat the dictator? No. Who knows where you're going to end up if you beat this dictator? So, in fact, he and his horse win the race. But about 20 yards after crossing the finish line, the horse stumbles and bam, they both fall face first into the turf. And the dictator is down and he's not getting up. Well, a couple hundred men rush out of the stands to go see if he's okay, to go see if they can help. And I can guarantee you, all of them were thinking this: I hope he's dead, but just in case, I'm right here and everybody can see that I'm right here. Because they really wanted him to be dead for sure. But nope, you couldn't say that. You couldn't look like that. You had to look helpful. They've inherited that sort of thing from the Soviet Union. Now we have quasi-independent places. We've mentioned these, right? These places say that they're countries, but not really. For instance, who thinks Abkhazia is a country? Well, Georgia doesn't, of course, it's part of Georgia. America doesn't, Norway doesn't, France doesn't, Thailand doesn't, South Africa doesn't. But South Ossetia does. South Ossetia says that Abkhazia is a country. Transnistria says that Abkhazia is a country. Nagorno-Karabakh, which is now called Artsakh, thinks that Abkhazia is a country. They're sort of looking out for each other. Because the same is true. South Ossetia, is that a country? Well, Abkhazia says, yeah, sure, South Ossetia is a country. Oh, yes, Transnistria says South Ossetia is a country. Artsakh says South Ossetia is a country. And so on. They each say that each other is a real country. Basically, no one else says so. But all that is part of the Soviet ethno-territorial system that Russia inherited, that says that even small ethnic groups should have some autonomy. Well, these ethnic groups are pushing it and are trying to get what I call the double upgrade. Instead of Abkhazia just taking one upgrade to be a republic within Georgia, they want the double upgrade to become independent country. Well, and that's what happened with Chechnya. Chechnya is a nearby piece of Russia, right there next to Georgia also, right by Georgia and Azerbaijan. And Chechnya said, hey, we want the double upgrade. The Soviet Union ended, and they saw nearby places, Georgia and Armenia, getting the single upgrade and becoming country. So Chechnya said, hey, we'd like to be upgraded, but we don't want to just go one step up and be a republic of Russia. We want the double upgrade. We want to become a new country. Well, Chechnya is just this little piece of territory. It's even hard to, oh, there it is on the map, this little kind of pink shaded territory. That's Chechnya. So on the one hand, if Russia said, go ahead, who cares, become a country, would it really matter? You could say probably not. I mean, it's right there, tiny. It actually does have an international border on Georgia. So if it became an independent country, it wouldn't hurt the structural integrity of Russia. There'd be no hole in the middle of Russia. It is on the edge. And it's just this little place, a few people, not much land. So it wouldn't really hurt Russia to lose that piece. But on the other hand, what if it became a precedent? What if it became the pattern? So what if that Tatar region asked for the double upgrade? What if they said, hey, we were the Tatar SSR, and now I know we're getting the upgrade to become the Tatar Republic. We'd like the double upgrade. We'd like to become country. What if that's what happened? What if they said, well, you gave it to Chechnya, so we'd like the double upgrade too? Well, the Tatar region is in the western part of Russia, but it is in the middle there. Doesn't have an international border. So if that happened and this Tatar region became a new country, then they would have a hole in the center of Russia. And they'd be totally surrounded by Russia. It's not so good. Well, instead they said, okay, no, you don't get a double upgrade, but we heard you'd like to change your name. So, okay, you can become the Republic of Tatarstan. You're a republic of the Russian Federation. Similarly, out in Siberia, that huge sort of compact shape in Siberia there, that was the Yakut SSR. What if Russia let Chechnya get the double upgrade and become an independent country? What would the Yakut SSR say? Hey, we'd like to become a country too. We'd like the double upgrade. Well, if that was allowed, then there'd be this huge chunk of Siberia missing. There'd be a new country. So Russia didn't want that to happen. So instead, they did let the Yakut SSR rename itself the Republic of Sakha. Turns out that Yakut was the Russian word for this place, and the natives called their land and their people Sakha. So it is now the Republic of Sakha within the Russian Federation. Well,